47, 48, 49. Sergeant Marcus Whelan counted under his breath while the rest of us pretended not to hear. The number kept climbing. He had been counting since dawn, and none of us knew what the numbers meant. You learn fast in armored warfare that commanders develop habits, little rituals to keep the fear tamped down where it belongs. Some pray, some hum, some tap patterns on the hull plating. Counting seemed harmless enough on the first day. By the third, I started dreading whatever number came next. The interior of a Vanquisher pattern battle tank smells like promethium exhaust, unwashed bodies, and the copper-tinged lubricant we use to keep the autoloader mechanisms cycling. 4 of us lived in that smell for 11 days during the siege of Kovac Heights. Sergeant Whelan in the commander's cupola, Reed Okonkwo on the main gun, Chen Novak driving, me feeding shells into the breach with hands that stopped shaking around day 2 because the muscles simply gave up on fear as a useful response. 53, 54. We had been awake for roughly 70 hours at that point. The enemy kept probing our lines with infantry, never enough to overrun but always enough to trigger the proximity sensors. Every time we started to drift off, the alarm would shriek and Whelan would snap us back to stations. Reed joked on the second night that it was like being married to a colicky infant. Nobody laughed. By the third night, Reed stopped making jokes entirely. I want to be clear about something. Marcus Whelan was not a bad commander. 12 years in armored divisions, 3 planetary campaigns, commendations from officers whose names I never learned and whose faces I never saw. He knew the machine like a priest knows his liturgies. He could diagnose engine trouble by the pitch of the turbines, could calculate firing solutions faster than the tank's own cogitator, could keep 4 exhausted soldiers functioning as a single weapon when everything outside wanted us dead. I trusted him the way you trust the deck plating to hold when you're walking through a ship. Automatic, complete. That trust made what happened worse. The siege of Kovac Heights was supposed to last 3 days. High Command assured us the enemy positions would collapse once we established our armored cordon around the industrial district. The propaganda reels they broadcast through our Vox systems showed enemy fortifications crumbling, showed grateful civilians streaming toward liberation zones, showed victory as an inevitable mathematical outcome of Imperial superiority. The propaganda reels did not mention that the enemy had dug tunnel networks beneath the entire city. They did not mention that our supply lines would be cut on day 4. They did not mention that we would spend the next week as a fixed defensive position, unable to retreat and unable to advance, burning through ammunition and sanity in equal measure. 61. 62. I asked Whelan what he was counting on the 4th day. He turned toward me from his position in the cupola, and I saw his eyes for the first time since we had buttoned up. The whites had gone pink with burst capillaries. His pupils were too large for the light level inside the hull. He looked at me the way you look at a stain on a wall, present but not particularly significant. Heartbeats, he said. I need to know how many heartbeats until the relief column arrives. If I count them all, the column will arrive faster. Mathematics, simple mathematics. Chen and Reed exchanged glances across the cramped interior. I loaded another shell into the ready rack and said nothing. What could I say? A man starts believing that counting heartbeats will summon reinforcements. You do not argue with him. You wait for the belief to fade. You wait for sleep to finally win against the stimulants we had been chewing. You wait for normal to reassert itself. We waited a long time. The Vox crackled with reports from other units in our squadron. Tank 7 had taken an engine hit and was burning 3 blocks north. Tank 12 had lost its commander to sniper fire through a vision slit and was operating under gunner authority. Tank 3 had run dry on ammunition and was serving as a fixed observation post. Every hour brought news of another piece of our cordon failing, another gap in the line that the enemy could exploit. Whelan listened to each report with his head cocked at an angle that reminded me of a dog hearing a sound too high for human ears. Then he would resume counting. 94, 95. The first night without sleep is uncomfortable, the second is painful. The third begins a process of deterioration that the Medicaid texts describe in clinical language, but that I can only describe as watching your mind come apart at the seams. Thoughts arrive incomplete. Sentences fragment mid-syllable. the boundary between what you are seeing and what you are imagining becomes a suggestion rather than a wall. I saw Chen talking to someone in the driver's compartment during hour 68, a full conversation with hand gestures and emotional responses, and when I asked who he was speaking with, he looked at me like I had asked whether water was wet. His wife, he said. She had come to visit. I could see her sitting on the transmission housing if I just looked closer. I did not look closer. Reed started sleeping with his eyes open around hour 70. He would stand at his station with his hands on the gun controls, pupils fixed on the targeting display, breathing regular, and be entirely unconscious. I discovered this when I spoke to him, and he did not respond. When I touched his shoulder, he came awake with a scream that nearly burst my eardrums in the confined space. After that, we stopped touching each other unless absolutely necessary. The startle response had become dangerous. 3 inches to the left and Reed's flailing hand would have struck the emergency ammunition ejection lever. We would have lost our entire shell supply onto the street below and become a 70-ton paperweight waiting for enemy infantry to crack us open. 119, 120. Wayland's voice had started changing. The counting remained steady, but between numbers he would mutter things. Names, mostly. People I did not know. He recited them like a roster call, waiting for responses that never came. Briggs, Carver, Dominguez, Falk, ghost voices answering roll call in a ghost regiment. I learned later that these were the soldiers he had served with during the Malvern Reach campaign, nearly all of them dead in a chemical attack that Whelan survived only because he had been temporarily assigned to a command bunker. 217 soldiers killed in 11 minutes by a nerve agent that the enemy was not supposed to possess. Whelan had listened to their screaming over the Vox until the last voice went silent. He had never spoken about it. His service record mentioned it as a single notation: sole surviving officer, 4th Armored, Malvern Reach. Combat effective, recommended for continued duty, combat effective. On the 5th day, Whelan heard the child. We were cycling through a maintenance routine, the kind of mindless busy work that commanders invent to keep crews from dwelling on their situation. I was cleaning the breach mechanism for the 4th time. Reed was calibrating the targeting cogitator. Chen was checking the track tension through the external sensors. Whelan was counting, still counting, the number now somewhere in the 400s. Then he stopped. The silence was more alarming than the counting had been. I looked up from the breach to find Whelan pressed against the commander's vision block, his face so close to the armored glass that his breath was fogging the surface. His hands had come up to either side of his head as if he were trying to hear better, fingers splayed, palms pressed against the hull plating. "There's a child outside," he said. None of us responded immediately. The enemy held the streets around our position. We had watched them execute 3 civilians who attempted to flee the combat zone just 2 days prior. The idea that a child would be wandering through the urban hellscape outside our hull was absurd. But Whelan's voice carried such absolute certainty that I found myself listening too. The usual sounds, distant artillery, the creak of settling rubble, wind through broken windows, the idling rumble of our own engine. Nothing that resembled a child's voice. Nothing that resembled any human voice at all. "Sergeant," Reed said carefully, "there's no one out there. The Auspex shows clear. The Auspex is wrong." Whelan did not turn from the vision block. "I can hear her. She's calling for help. She's calling for her mother. We need to open the hatch. We need to—" "We cannot open the hatch, Sergeant." Chen's voice came through the internal Vox from the driver's compartment, patient and slow. The voice you use with the very young or the very confused. "Enemy snipers have the approach covered. We discussed this. Anyone who exits the tank dies. Then she dies." Whelan finally turned from the vision block, and his eyes had changed again. The pink had darkened to red. He was crying without appearing to notice, tears tracking through the grime on his face. "We let her die. We sit in here with our armor and our ammunition, and we let a child die in the street because we're afraid. I should have recognized what was happening. The Medicaid briefings before deployment had warned us about this specific pattern. Extreme sleep deprivation produces hallucinations. The hallucinations become fixed beliefs. The fixed beliefs generate emotional responses completely detached from reality. But understanding the mechanism does not help when you are watching it happen to someone you trusted with your life. Understanding does not help when the man giving you orders has stopped being the man you knew. There is no child, Sergeant. I kept my voice flat. Emotional responses would only feed his delusion. The street is empty. The Auspex confirms it. What I'm hearing is a child dying because we are cowards. Whelan's voice rose, cracking on the last word. I've heard that sound before. I've heard children dying. I know what it sounds like. I know what it... He stopped. His head tilted again, that dog listening to a whistle angle, and his expression shifted from grief to something worse. Recognition. Terrible private recognition of a sound that existed only in his memory. She's singing, he whispered. She's singing the same song they were singing when the gas came. How does she know that song? How does she... Reed reached for him. I do not know what Reed intended, perhaps to restrain him, perhaps to comfort him, perhaps just to make contact with another human being in that metal coffin that was slowly becoming a tomb. Whelan reacted before Reed's hand touched his shoulder. The combat knife came out of its sheath with a sound I can still hear in quiet moments, a small metallic whisper that seemed far too soft for what followed. Reed jerked backward, his hand pressed against the side of his neck, blood welling between his fingers in the dim illumination of the hull lights. The cut was shallow, reflex, not intent. Whelan looked at the knife in his hand as if someone else had put it there, his face cycling through confusion, horror, and then something that frightened me more than the violence itself. Calm. A terrible, settled calm that suggested he had made a decision that the rest of us were not yet aware of. The hatches stay closed, he said. The child stays outside. We all stay inside. That's how we survive. That's the mathematics. He climbed back into the commander's cupola and resumed counting. 467. 468. Reed's wound needed treatment. We had a basic medical kit. Mounted on the hull wall, standard issue for armored crews, and I cleaned and sealed the cut, while Reed stared at nothing with the glassy expression of a man reassessing everything he thought he knew. The bleeding stopped. The wound was not serious, but something had torn that could not be sutured shut. We had served under Whelan for 2 years. We had trusted him to keep us alive. Now we understood that the man in the commander's cupola was no longer the man we had trusted. He wore the same face, he spoke with the same voice, but somewhere behind his eyes, something had broken in a way that might not be fixable. Chen suggested we relieve him of command. The regulations allowed for it. A commander demonstrably unfit for duty could be replaced by the next senior crew member, which was Reed. But Reed shook his head without speaking, and I understood why. Whelan still controlled the hatch mechanisms. The commander's cupola had an emergency override that could lock or unlock every access point on the tank. If we attempted to remove him and failed, he could trap us inside with him, or he could open the hatches and let the enemy in, or he could do something worse, something that the knife incident suggested he was capable of. We chose to wait. The relief column was supposed to arrive within 36 hours. High Command had confirmed it over the Vox. All we had to do was survive 36 hours with a man who heard phantom children singing songs from a massacre. 36 hours. I did not sleep during those 36 hours, neither did Chen or Reed. We watched Whelan the way prey animals watch a predator that has wandered into their territory, tracking every movement, cataloging every twitch. He counted. He listened to sounds we could not hear. He spoke to people who were not there, holding conversations with soldiers whose names I now recognized from his muttered roll calls. Briggs, who had been his gunner on Malvan Reach. Carver, his loader. Dominguez, his driver. Falk, a sergeant from another tank who had died screaming that his lungs were full of glass. I learned more about Marcus Whelan in those 36 hours than I had learned in 2 years of serving under him. I learned that he had requested transfer to our unit specifically because none of us had served on Malvan Reach. None of us knew what he had survived. None of us could look at him and see the 217 ghosts that followed him everywhere. He had built a new life on a foundation of silence, and the sleep deprivation had demolished that foundation. 512, 513. On hour 90 of our sleeplessness, Wayland stopped counting. The silence was worse than before. The counting had become a kind of background noise, almost soothing in its regularity. When it stopped, the absence pressed against my ears like a physical weight. I looked up at the commander's cupola and saw Wayland working on something I could not see from my position. His hands moved with precise, deliberate motions. I heard the hiss of a cutting torch. "What are you doing, Sergeant?" Reed's voice was hoarse. We had been rationing water for 3 days, making sure Wayland did not turn from his work. "She's still out there. The child. She's been singing for 2 days now. She won't stop. She won't stop unless I make her stop. But I can't go out there. If I go out there, they get in here. So I'm making sure they can't get in here. Then I can go stop her singing. Then we can all sleep." The implications arrived slowly, filtered through exhaustion. He was welding the hatches. He was sealing us inside. He was creating a tomb so that he could open a door. "Sergeant, stop." Chen's voice cracked through the internal vox. "Do not weld the hatches. That is a direct violation of violations." Wayland laughed, a sound I had never heard from him, high and wrong. 217 violations of the promise I made to bring them home safe. Every one of them trusted me. Every one of them followed my orders. Every one of them died screaming while I listened from a bunker 3 kilometers away. "You want to talk to me about violations?" The torch hissed, metal glowed. The emergency hatch seal fused into a single mass. I understood then that we would not be waiting for the relief column. We would be fighting for our lives against our own commander in a metal box, 8 feet wide and 12 feet long. The mathematics Wayland kept talking about had reduced to their simplest form: 3 of us, 1 of him, 1 knife, and no way out. Reed moved first. He was closest to Wayland's position, and he had the most reason. The bandage on his neck had begun to spot with fresh blood where the movement reopened his wound. He lunged upward, reaching for Wayland's legs, trying to pull him down from the cupola before he could weld the second hatch. The struggle lasted perhaps 4 seconds. It ended with Reed on the deck plating, his arm bent at an angle that arms are not designed to bend, screaming in a voice that did not sound human. Wayland stood over him with the cutting torch still lit, the blue flame wavering inches from Reed's face. "I'm sorry." Wayland's voice had gone quiet again, reasonable, almost gentle. "I'm sorry, but you don't understand. You haven't heard her singing. When you hear her singing, you'll understand. I have to stop her singing. That's the only way any of us sleep again." He climbed back into the cupola. The torch hissed against the second hatch, metal fused. We were sealed in. I do not know how many hours passed after that. Time had stopped having meaning. We existed in a state of perpetual crisis, 3 wounded animals trapped with a 4th who had shed his humanity somewhere in the space between counting heartbeats. Reed's arm required splinting. Chen had begun talking to his wife again, extended conversations with the empty air of the driver's compartment. I focused on staying awake, on watching Wayland, on keeping. The loaded shell rack between my body and the commander's cupola. Wayland spoke to the dead. Not his crew from Malvan Reach anymore, his family. I learned he had a daughter. Her name was Eva. She was 7 years old when he deployed to our sector. He had recorded messages for her on his personal Vox unit, little stories about the places he had seen and the people he served with. He played those messages now, his own voice echoing from the small speaker, and he responded to himself as if Eva was speaking. "I know, sweetheart," he said to a recording of his own voice. "I know you miss me. I miss you too. But I have to stay here. I have to keep counting until the column arrives. That's how mathematics works. You count enough heartbeats, the good things happen. You stop counting, the gas comes. The gas comes and everyone dies. You don't want everyone to die, do you?" He paused, listening to his recorded self describe a sunset on a world whose name I did not recognize. "That's my good girl. That's my brave girl." The relief column arrived 17 hours later than promised. I know this because I heard their Vox transmissions as they approached our position. Imperial armor, 2 full squadrons, rolling through the streets we had been staring at for 11 days. They called for our unit, They called for Tank 9, Kovac Heights Sector, requesting status report. Whelan answered. I do not know what he told them. His voice had gone calm again, that reasonable command voice that had once made us feel safe. Whatever he said convinced them to approach. I heard the rumble of their engines growing closer. I heard them stop outside our hull. I heard someone knocking on the welded hatch, demanding to know why we had sealed ourselves in. Whelan told them about the child. There was a long silence from outside. Then another voice, someone with command authority, speaking in the careful tone that officers use when they realize something has gone very wrong. Sergeant Whelan, there is no child outside your tank. There is no one outside your tank. The sector has been cleared. We need you to open your hatches and report for medical evaluation. The hatches don't open. Whelan sounded apologetic. I had to weld them. She was trying to get in. The singing was so loud, I had to make sure she couldn't get in. More voices outside, discussion I could not follow, then the sounds of cutting equipment being brought forward. They were going to breach the hull. They were going to cut through the welds and extract us whether Whelan agreed or not. The sergeant heard the cutting start. I watched his face change as the sound registered, as he understood that his carefully sealed tomb was being opened. The calm evaporated, something else took its place, something I had seen only once before, in the eyes of a wounded animal that knows it cannot escape, and has decided to make its death mean something. They're letting her in, he said. They don't understand. They're letting her in and we're all going to die. We're all going to die screaming like Briggs and Carver and Dominguez and Falk and... He drew his knife. Reed was down. Chen was unresponsive in the driver's compartment, lost in conversation with a phantom wife. I was the only one left, and I was trapped in a space too small to dodge, too crowded to fight, too enclosed to survive what was coming. Whelan climbed down from the cupola with the blade already moving, his eyes fixed on something behind me, something that I knew was not there, but that he saw with absolute clarity. I do not remember deciding to reach for the emergency fire suppression lever. I do not remember pulling it, but I remember the foam. Industrial fire suppression designed to extinguish promethium fires in a confined space, erupting from every vent in the hull. The foam filled my mouth, my nose, my eyes. It filled the entire interior in seconds, dense and choking and utterly blinding. I cannot tell you what happened in the foam, I cannot tell you how long I fought something I could not see. I cannot tell you whether the sounds I heard were Whelan drowning in the suppression medium, or the relief crews cutting through our hull, or my own screaming translated through 3 inches of chemical slurry. What I can tell you is that when the hatch finally fell inward and hands pulled me out into the light, I was holding Whelan's knife, and my uniform was wet with something that was not foam. They found Sergeant Marcus Whelan at the bottom of the hull, under a layer of fire suppression medium that had begun to harden into a crust. He was still alive, his eyes were still open. He was still counting, his lips moving around numbers that no longer made sound. The Medicaid team extracted him with the same careful motions they would use to handle unexploded ordnance. They strapped him to a stretcher and carried him toward a transport vehicle while he stared at the sky with those red, ruined eyes. He stopped counting as they loaded him. His head turned toward me, tracking my position with unsettling precision, and for one moment I saw the man he had been before Malvern reach, before the gas, before 217 soldiers trusted him to bring them home. "Can you hear her?" he asked. His voice was barely a whisper. "She's still singing. She never stopped. She's going to sing until we all die. Can you hear her?" I told him no. I told him there was no child. I told him the same things we had been telling him for days, the reasonable words that meant nothing against the architecture of his delusion. He smiled. The smile was worse than anything else. "You will," he said. "You stayed in the tank with me. You breathed the same air. You'll hear her soon. You'll count the heartbeats. You'll do the mathematics. It's the only way to make her stop singing." They took him away. The transport disappeared into the convoy forming to evacuate our position. I never learned what happened to him. Psychological reconditioning. Probably. Chemical intervention. Maybe a quiet death in a facility that officially does not exist. The Imperium has no use for broken commanders. The Imperium has no use for anyone who cannot serve. I served. I served through the rest of the Kovac Heights campaign. I served through reassignment to a new crew, a new commander, a new tank with hatches that opened when they were supposed to open. I served through 2 more years of armored warfare, never sleeping more than 4 hours at a stretch, never allowing myself to fall into the deep exhaustion that had cracked Whelan open like an egg. The problem is that Whelan was right about the mathematics. I hear her now. Not always, not clearly. But in the quiet moments between engagements, in the long watches when the rest of the crew is cycling through their rest shifts, I hear a child singing somewhere outside the hull. A song I do not recognize, a voice I have never encountered. She sings and sings and sings, and I understand now why Whelan started counting. The counting gives you something to focus on. The counting fills the space where the singing would otherwise drive you mad. I have not told anyone. The moment I report auditory hallucinations, my service ends. The moment I admit what I hear, I become Whelan, strapped to a stretcher and carried toward a future that contains nothing but chemical restraints and quiet rooms. So I count. I count heartbeats. I count shell casings. I count the rivets in the hull plating above my station. I count the hours until my next deployment, and the days until my next rotation, and the months until my service contract expires. The numbers do not summon relief columns. The numbers do not stop the singing, but the numbers fill my mouth with something other than screaming. And that is enough. It has to be enough. 1427, 1428. My new commander has started giving me strange looks. He asked me yesterday what I was. Muttering under my breath, I told him I was running calculations, ammunition counts, fuel consumption, the mathematics of survival. He seemed satisfied with the answer. He does not know that I have started seeing Chen's wife. She sits on the transmission housing during night watch, just where Chen described her, and she watches me with eyes that never blink. She does not speak, she does not move. She simply watches, patient and silent, waiting for me to acknowledge her presence. I do not acknowledge her, I count instead. 1463, 1464. The singing is getting louder.